Photography Daily.
There's something very deep inside of me that Tibet and the Tibetans just resonate with me. So I had always wanted to go there and then decided to go there for my 50th birthday.
Today we talk about life-changing moments. Marissa Roth returns to chat with me about a photographic trip that becomes a project and then book and, in all honesty, as you'll hear her suggest, a liberation.
I feel like Tibet, in a way, saved me. You know, it pulled me out of the little house, it pulled me out of the war project, and it just activated this incredibly deep, creative space.
If you've thought about making a journey like this, today is an episode peppered with creative, mental and practical advice.
And so I found Kodachrome, found a little camera that I could use because I knew Tibet is tricky to be a professional photographer, and I just wanted to pass myself off as a tourist.
We talk about making pictures in a country where the average elevation is the best part of 15,000 feet.
I had such bad altitude sickness. You know, it's like an altered state. It's sort of weirdly wonderful and horrible at the same time because I felt like my brain, I couldn't overthink anything because I felt so awful, but I was almost in this heightened state of awareness and sensitivity.
And because we're talking about producing a book, I thought a behind-the-scenes tour might be in order.
I'm a pretty ruthless editor of my work, which probably comes out of being a photojournalist for newspapers for 25 years, where you have to be so spare, otherwise your photo editor is never going to hire you again.
In the second part of today's interview, I try to unpick what it takes to organise a photographic adventure somewhere out of the ordinary from a photojournalist who's travelled the world making stories.
Try to go from your left brain into your right brain and not have any expectations of what you think you should be doing or seeing.
We talk about the anxiety traps.
Okay, if I go, I have to justify going by coming away with something. So I would say take all of that, which is really nice, but it's also very constricting.
So today is about Tibet, but I also want to inspire you, perhaps both of us actually, you and I, to think about making our photographic pilgrimage somewhere. Maybe close, maybe far away, but wherever we go, to learn to embrace this gift we have making pictures.
Being a photographer is also, you're absorbing the experience, and that becomes part of who you are, rather than you trying to impose who you are.
Stories of life told by photographers, and today that photographer is Marissa Roth.
You know, let the road meet you, let the experience meet you, because also you want to learn from it.
Patron of the day today is Katie Docking. I'll link to Katie's work on the show page. Just look for that link on your podcast player show app today, which will transport you to our links, including immersing yourself in her work. Katie actually shares similar thoughts on something we were discussing last week, showing the everything. Quote, "In a world where everyone is trying to show their best life on social media, the everyday parts of life often get forgotten. But that's the bit that fascinates me the most. I love the little details of life, those things we take for granted, that when we look back, create a sense of nostalgia for times gone by." Katie, I want to sing hallelujah, but I'm saving us both from that embarrassment. And since today we're talking about how life-fulfilling and enriching photo projects can be, this is Katie is the perfect patron of the day. Because I'd like to talk about remote photography, which is one of her projects you'll find on her website. Again, I'll quote from the site, "I've been running a project which looks at the relationship between people with cystic fibrosis and transplant recipients and their pets. As someone who's part of this community, I sought huge comfort from my dog during difficult times with my health. I noticed that I was not alone in this and that there were many other people like me who had incredible bonds with pets that seemed even stronger because of what they'd been through. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and existing cross-infection issues, it wasn't practical or safe for me to photograph this community face-to-face, so I used a remote shooting app to connect to each participant's smartphone. It's a project that's right at the start of its journey by the looks of it, but in the few short weeks since the inception, I can see how important it's going to become to you, Katie, and those that you photograph. and I'll include that link today. Lots of links. And I'll talk about how, like Katie, you can support this show through Patreon later on, which seems more appropriate. We're also supported by mpb.com, who help you buy, sell and trade used camera gear in the US, the UK and Europe. And I think it's important to add that it's a service I personally use. I've bought used camera gear through them because I like the idea that they provide a guarantee. I've sold kit I no longer use through them, and I've traded gear in against equipment I really want to add to my kit bag. And they make every step of this journey fair and easy, and that is why I keep going back to mpb.com. So, to Marissa Roth then. Well, in episode 206, not long back, we talked together about her project, One Person Crying Women and War, how this Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer with the LA Times shared photographically how women in numerous countries and cultures have been directly affected by war and its aftermath. It's a project that consumed her photographic thoughts for 35 years. But though that was a body of work that's claimed, rightly so, the notoriety and recognition it deserves, we didn't talk about a project that has, to quote again, saved her photography. Her trip and subsequent photographic journal and study of life in Tibet. And here's what, that name, Tibet, reveals upon a Google search. An autonomous region of China. It shares Mount Everest with Nepal. Its capital, Lhasa, is the site of hilltop Potala Palace, once the Dalai Lama's winter home, and Jokang Temple, Tibet's spiritual heart, revered for its golden statue of the young Buddha, which of course sounds like a travelogue in itself, and we'll talk about that in context of an uprising that Marissa believes has made the latterly mentioned temple some kind of theme park. But there's much to talk about today generally. I've split our conversation then into several parts. That final half in our time of conversation being about travel, because today I hope to inspire you, perhaps, maybe for us to make plans for some trips again when we feel confident enough that the world is opening up enough. Loosely, I'm thinking of that part as finding your photographic travel voice. It's it's almost a decade since I took a trip to Hungary, to Budapest. I went post-Christmas and it was cold, very cold. Oddly unnerving, as I hadn't done anything like that for many years. And it turned out to be a 3-day photo walk, which would have made a collection of super episodes for a podcast, which at the time was a medium in its real infancy, where only those who completely understood what an RSS feed is would have had the wherewithal or indeed even interest to follow. I made pictures on a camera I bought from the proceeds of an inheritance. It was a camera gift to myself, a Leica M8. It wasn't the best camera then, and even with a proper nostalgic nod, it still isn't. But there was an attachment to it for this trip, and I made a diary too, which I found when I was writing this piece, and I'll read that in tomorrow's More edition on the Patreon channel. Most importantly, at that time, I think I needed a project, so that my photography wasn't just about the pound notes and people saying I do. That project didn't save my photography like the one you're about to hear about from Marissa. I was still very new as a professional, 5 or 6 years in, but it did show me the power of the project. And whilst we're talking projects, also on tomorrow's More edition, the new book club is all about projects to go with today's episode, and then my story of Budapest as well. The book we talk about tomorrow is called People in Cars by Mike Mandel, and my hope is that these chats across the next couple of days will really inspire the creative part of you that says, I've always wanted an adventure. I want to go and make pictures of X. So let's hear then about Marissa Roth's photographic pilgrimage to Tibet. 72 images and a book called Infinite Light that she describes as her love letter to the roof of the world. Marissa, we talked last time about your background and incredible work, One Person Crying Women in War, but there were so many other facets and projects that you've worked on that I wanted to come back and talk to you about those. And I I perhaps want to start with the obvious one, Tibet with Infinite Light, a photographic meditation on Tibet, which is equally a book which His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote the foreword for. The name, the ultimate figurehead, I would imagine, you would want associated with this. That must have been a real joy and privilege.
It was beyond a privilege that His Holiness agreed to write the foreword. It was monumental in a sense that I felt that I'd sort of hit a level in my work. I thought, where do you go after this? Now I can coast a little bit. It was pretty amazing. And first I was sent just a copy of the letter through an email. And then through a very circuitous FedEx route, the letter arrived like 2 weeks later on the Dalai Lama letterhead, So it was just like, yeah, it's pretty fantastic. I haven't been able to meet him. I've heard him speak, but I don't know if I ever will, but he's his energy, and he's remarkable. So no, I'm really honored to have that.
Well, I think it'd be fair to say that there's a deep curiosity that you have about Tibet, the culture and the people. What took you there?
So I was living in Asia in the late 80s, early 90s. I lived in the Philippines, and then I was going all through Asia a lot. I love Asia, and doing work for different publications, and then did a number of stories for the Los Angeles Times on the Tibetan diaspora.
Yeah.
And so, but I always had like a thing for Tibet. I can't explain it. And at one point I was visiting a friend in India, and he was a journalist, and he had to go to Pakistan for work. And I ended up going down to Goa, India, by myself, just to take a little break, and met some Tibetan refugees who just literally had a blanket on the side of the road selling, jewelry and things. And anyway, I bought this necklace. I don't know if you can
you
see
wearing it? Yeah.
Yeah. So I've literally been wearing this necklace for 32 years every day.
Wow.
And the husband, he said to me, this will always bring you luck. And I don't know, it's like there's something very deep inside of me that Tibet and the Tibetans just resonate with me. So I had always wanted to go there, and then decided to go there for my 50th birthday. It was a remarkable trip. I didn't know if I would photograph, if I would be inspired to photograph. Before the trip, I did a lot of thinking, what do I want to photograph with? And I knew I didn't want to photograph black and white. And I was familiar sort of with the color palette of Tibet through other photographers' work. And so I decided on Kodachrome as the film I would use. And so I found Kodachrome, found a little camera that I could use, because I knew Tibet is tricky to be a professional photographer. And I just wanted to pass myself off as a tourist. So anyway, I was still in sort of my photojournalist brain, and I was thinking, okay, so what do I photograph? Maybe the interface between the Tibetan and the Han, Chinese communities. But before I went, I bought 100 rolls of film. And before I went, I sort of had this vision almost, which never sort of had happened before, that I would sequence the images by color, like the colors of the Tibetan prayer flags. Didn't pre-imagine what I was going to photograph, but I had this vision. We got to Tibet. I did my idea of this interface for 2 hours the first afternoon, completely uninspired. And then I had such bad altitude sickness. It's like an altered state. And it's sort of weirdly wonderful and horrible at the same time, because I felt like my brain, I couldn't overthink anything because I felt so awful, but I was almost in this heightened state of awareness and sensitivity. And I was just sort of feeling Tibet, and rather than seeing it. So I just kind of let go of the idea of what to photograph, and just started photographing. So it was an extraordinary trip. And there were days when I felt like I just needed to show up, and the picture was there.
Did you know at this stage, though, that you were going to produce a book? Because you went twice in the end, didn't you, to produce the pictures in the book?
Yeah, so the first trip was really just kind of, birthday with my then husband, and came back to LA. Ironically, or synchronicity-wise, the marriage dissolved. Pretty much, we came apart after the trip, and I wanted to go back to Tibet immediately. I wanted to go back that fall, but life, I couldn't do it. Yeah. And then I was thinking to go back the next year, but then it was the Tibetan uprising in March of 2008. They closed the doors, and then in 2009, I was so caught on the Women in War project. I went to Cambodia, went to Bosnia twice. So psychologically, I just was in Women in War, and, financially it was, and Tibet's an intense trip. I mean, it's not, you have to kind of be in a physical place and mental place to go. But I had this like ache. It was like a homesickness to go back there. And then in 2010, Kodak announced that they were going to be discontinuing the chemistry to develop Kodachrome at the one photo lab in North America that processed the film, which was in Kansas.
Oh.
So you had to have your film into the lab by December 31st. So I had one of those moments where I sat outside with a glass of wine and I thought, okay, do I go back or do I give up on the project? And I thought, I have to go back. And so I called a good friend of mine. I said, so do you want to go to Tibet? I'll pay your way. It wasn't expensive, because I just really was the airfare, but anyway. So she agreed. And so we went back in September of 2010. So I went with this good friend of mine.
What an extraordinary dilemma. So it was the chemistry that was the deciding factor, or do you think you might have gone back one day, but with just altered plans?
Well, I think it was more, I chose to finish it.
Yeah. Okay.
But at the same time, those were some dark years for me. I'd just gotten through my second divorce. The first divorce was unexpected. The second one was pretty shattering. And I sort of, that ex-husband came with family. And so I felt like I lost a whole family. So, and those were some pretty intense years also working on Women in War. And I feel like Tibet in a way saved me. It pulled me out of the little house. It pulled me out of the war project. And it just activated this incredibly deep, creative space within myself.
I have talked to people that have been to Tibet and I've said, what's it like? And they look at me with a twinkle in their eye and say, I can't really tell you, you just have to go.
I mean, I tell people, I know they find it shocking, but I tell people I could have died in Tibet and been very happy to finish my life at that point.
Wow.
And I can't explain it. I mean, it was so powerful, but I felt like it was all very familiar. And I don't know. I mean, I felt it was like the happiest I've ever been. It was the most content I've ever been. I felt like I was home in a way. I mean, I had an amazing experience at one of the nunneries in Lhasa. I'd been there on the first trip, but I wanted to go back a second trip because I went with a woman friend and I wanted her to experience it. And it was a much less sort of planned out trip. The first trip, we were just like going over land in constant motion. And the second trip, I said, I just want to base ourselves in Lhasa and kind of just go at the pace that feels comfortable, do what we want to do. So we went to the nunnery. And then at one point we sat with the nuns who were rolling prayers to be inserted into little handheld prayer wheels. And then we went back a second time in the afternoon when they were in prayer. So their prayer sanctuary is fairly small. And I was sitting sort of on a back bench. And one of the nuns beckoned me to sit next to her on the bench, the prayer bench, in between two nuns. And I thought, oh my God, this is a really auspicious, experience. I mean, I was really honored. Yeah. And I sat down on the seat and it was like, I thought, oh, this is my seat. It was that kind of almost metaphysical experience. Yeah. I mean, it was like, okay.
For context and to understand Marissa Roth's relationship with Tibet now, I read up on 2008's wave of protests. They began in Lhasa on the 10th of March that year. More than 150 separate protests were documented across the region. The overwhelming majority of the protests are reported as non-violent in nature. The Chinese leadership imposed a crackdown in all Tibetan areas to suppress these protests, leading to the arrest of thousands of Tibetans and the reported deaths of over 100 Tibetans. Figures do vary, and some reports are far higher. The Tibetan media refer to this time as a new uprising. The demonstrations were held to commemorate the 49th anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan Uprising Day, when the 14th Dalai Lama escaped from Tibet. The protests and demonstrations spread spontaneously to a number of monasteries. The arrest of monks increased the tense nature of the situation. And then came the reports of Chinese police and People's Liberation Army units using force on non-violent protests by monks and nuns. Demonstrators in Lhasa were countered by force, electric prods, tear gas and shootings, according to a report by Human Rights Watch. Pictures of Tibetan monks in Chinese custody and being presented on television to apologize and admit to wrongdoing was met with international concern and disbelief.
I was being provoked by all the people calling out for all Tibetans to join them. I have never been in jail before. I truly regret it.
I know I'll never go back. And at the airport leaving on the second trip, I was bereft. I couldn't stop weeping because I knew I would never go back there.
Why will you never go back?
Well, there's two reasons. One, I'm actually probably persona non grata now because the Dalai Lama wrote the foreword for the book.
Of course, yeah.
And the other one, Neil, is those two trips were so extraordinary. I don't know. I can't explain it. They just were so, not perfect, that's the wrong word, but they were so complete. I would not want to go back and change those memories. Plus, I struggled during the second trip, actually, to stay blinkered, if you will. I knew about the uprising. I knew a lot of monks had been killed. I could tell some of the changes that were already being implemented by the Chinese government. You know, they were paving over big areas around monasteries for, you know, tour buses. There was, on the road to the Ganden Monastery, they had embedded a red star, like stones painted red in the shape of a star in the side of the hill going up to the monastery. There were police stations being built in the main monasteries. And so that was tearing at me. And I could just feel that the uprising was horrendous. So, you know, there was a part of me also that just wanted to keep the purity of the place, the people that I'd met, the Buddhism. So I want to retain that as the experience and the memory. But it's, you know, doing the book was really wrenching because I knew I wanted to do the book, but I also didn't want to let go of all the feelings. You know, I wanted to keep it inside, and yet I knew I couldn't. I had to manifest it. So,
and the book ends up, well, it's described as a political statement book as well, isn't it? Of those experiences that you were having. Do you look at it like that?
I would say no. I mean, I have strong opinions, you know, and I allude to, you know, that in a tiny bit in my afterword, basically addressing what will be irrevocably lost. But I wanted it to be deeper than that. I wanted it to be about Tibetan Buddhism as a practice, as a way of life, as something so deep. There's a Tibet scholar on the East Coast named Robbie Barron, I think. And he said in one of his books that Tibetans are the best that humans will ever be. I want people to feel what it is to be there, feel the devotion, feel the energy. It's not all light. I mean, it can be quite dark there as well.
Yeah, there are some pictures that suggest. There was one particular picture, just the handprints on the wall, which to me felt like the hallmarks of political struggle. Those sort of pictures always do to me.
You are so insightful. So So those handprints were at the Jokan Monastery. So monks occasionally would sort of slap their hand.
Right.
I don't think that, I know that's part of sort of a Buddhist act. I don't know what it represents, but when I saw those and I photographed them, I felt like they were angry handprints.
That's what it feels like. Yeah, they're heavy, aren't they? Boom.
Yeah, and that monastery actually was one of the two big monasteries that actually fomented the uprising in 2009.
Oh.
So that photograph was in 2008, sorry. So that photograph was 2007. And apparently a lot of monks were killed in that uprising there. And now, tragically, I've just heard recently that the monastery has sort of been turned a bit into like a Disneyland attraction.
There are people pictures, but equally this isn't a documentary work in that sense. Many of the pictures are the proper stuff of life, which you seem very good at doing, actually. There's robes and fabrics and flowers in the half light and the literal foot of a statue with money that's been donated below. One of your champion pictures on your website is a flower in the water with a note below it. It feels to me like a collection of personal curiosity here and there.
Well, I think, yes. I mean, but for me, you know, the place and the people are revealed in those details.
Yeah.
You know, so that was actually a huge vat of water actually at the entrance of the Jokan Monastery. And somebody was floating Gerber daisies. And then the yuan notes are offerings from pilgrims, which they would leave in the monastery, or like the Buddha's foot. But I just thought it was so beautiful. But you see all over Asia, you see they'll have vats of water, you know, like floating flowers. Actually, I started doing that at home, and something so beautiful with that.
Yeah.
But I just thought it was also a bit of a trompe-l'oeil, you know, because you see the reflection of a cloud, but it's like people look at that and they don't know what it is. They think it's fake, but I'm like, it's a totally straight photograph.
No.
But I love that. I love that mystery too, where it's a straight image, but it's like up is down, or what is that? Or it's, you know, it kind of tweaks your perception. You know, it forces you to think, maybe just to pivot thought a bit.
There's also a lot of movement in the pictures, isn't there? They're pulling across light and shadows, and sometimes there seems to be movement that you've created by moving your camera at the same time. That sort of probably plays on the energy of the place that you were talking about, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but I've always had movement in my images.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, again, the energy there is so strong, and some of the movement. So there's a couple pictures that I took in the car on the way to the airport on the last morning. We left before dawn. And so I had the dawn light, you know, like the moon and the moving trees. And at that point, I was just completely like allowing myself to just almost play, you know, just hitting the shutter release and not even knowing what I was going to get. It was just this random thing. I just completely let go. I mean, with some skill involved as well, but you never know. And the result for me, and a couple of them, there's that one that's sort of purple with like an upside down house almost. I mean, that's a straight photograph. And to me, it's just so beautiful that it really feels like Tibet in a sense. So
when you've created all these pictures, how do you then turn it into a book? There's various versions of the book. One of the books had the most glorious of covers as well. But how do you turn this work into a, you know, you've got all this work, these pictures, you will sequence them obviously, but then you need to turn it into an exhibition and a book. How did you go about that?
Well, the Tibet project, I don't know. I was very clear on it. And so I'm a pretty ruthless editor of my work, which probably comes out of being a photojournalist for newspapers for 25 years, where you have to be so spare. Otherwise, your photo editor is never going to hire you again. So with the Tibet work, so I started editing the pictures, and then I made prints. And then that first idea of sequencing by color came back to me. And so I started laying out the pictures just in fragments of color and sort of dispersing images that sort of started relating to each other. And then when I ran out of floor space, because I was living in a little house, so I'd have to pull them up and then I had 5 or 6 huge pieces of cardboard cut So then I could put them around my kitchen. And then I started taping them like as a sequence clockwise. But I saw it, I just saw it as a walking meditation, the installation as a walking meditation, so that the images would be very close to each other, but that each one would relate to the next one, but that they would drive you through to the end. So I literally spent 5 months sequencing the images. And then if there was a gap, like between images, or if there's something I felt was missing, I literally re-edited all the film, had more prints scanned, more images scanned, and then prints. And then finally, after 5 months, I felt like I had a sequence. And then I did a book dummy, which my photo agent ended up shopping around for publishers. But then I also had a Tibetan friend who was willing to help me to make a presentation to the Dalai Lama. So I did up a very expensive little, like a facsimile of the book to size. I decided the size, the title, everything. And so we sent one of those to Dharamsala. And then my photo agent found the publisher. And then I was taking like a binding class with a binder, because I still love handmade books and I wanted to learn how to do it. And she had some amazing binding fabric. So I came upon the binding fabric that I thought would be beautiful for the book. So it was a very, sort of compatible experience. And then the publisher had a wonderful book designer who then I collaborated with. But I chose, to have the images just with the black, so that there was no white anywhere except for the white in the photographs. And this designer is a great colorist. So it was a collaboration, and I love collaborating with other skilled people. I'm not that possessive. But Tibet was a complete vision, and I had sort of carte blanche to do it.
We're back with Marissa Roth in a moment. Photography Daily launched on the 1st of June 2020. In the last year, we've spoken with photo legends, talked about photographers' personal stories, heard about their journeys, such as this one today, shared what picture making means, made sure to talk mental health and inclusivity during hundreds of hours of audio. And that bank of knowledge and resource will just keep building if you can help support the show with a small donation per month, because that is what keeps this project afloat. Some patrons donate the cost of a coffee, some the coffee and a cake, the others the cost of a couple of rolls of HP5, my favourite film stock per month, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you, pictures-wise that is. And because I value those that show their passion for the project, I write and present a diary and now book club piece every single week on a Thursday about all manner of photographic stuff. We're a small team. Unlike my time in radio years ago where I learned, there's no large script department here, recording department, research team, editor and so on. So you can help support the show if you like the fact that it's all about the journey of being a photographer over and above kit reviews by joining our Patreon club. Go to photographydaily.show and click on the Patreon page, which you'll see clearly at the top there in the menu. And once you've done that, it's easy to hear the additional stuff through a new app on your phone or the desktop, and you'll be supporting the creative world and of course become part of our community. Right, let's return to Marissa to learn this time about making your own photographic journeys and projects, with something very important as well to talk about when it comes to opening your mind and heart to the pictures that you make for you. Let's spend a few moments talking about some of your other projects, Marissa, that within the Women in War edition just didn't seem an appropriate time to talk about. Street Scene, scene as in S-E-E-N, which is about car culture. I often talk about projects on this show and the importance of having something from which to hang your photographic creative hat. So let's talk about your projects, and we'll start with Street Scene. Tell me about that.
So I was sort of living in the Mid-Wilshire area of LA at that point, near the LA County Museum of Art. And the City of LA Public Art Division, I was on their roster of they would send out calls for submissions for projects, sort of curator because I also curate. So that was to my curator side. And so I realized that I had sort of the beginnings of a really interesting series. Now, that series was shot with digital. And so how that whole series actually started was I was teaching a photography workshop for the LA Center of Photography, and it was a street shooting class. And so I would take my students out on Saturday mornings, wherever we decided to go, whether it was, the big market area in downtown LA, or we went to Santa Monica to the pier one day. And then we were on a hot August morning at a Indonesian festival in sort of almost downtown LA. And my students, they were all dispersed, but I still was around to, be the mother hen if they needed to talk to me. And I had my big digital camera. So I was actually really bored. And so I just started playing with the exposure, actually, and took that picture of the walking woman. That's the opening image, just of like this woman's skirt and calf. And I stopped down so hard on the exposure to basically obliterate any highlights. And then I saw it and I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting. So I really started experimenting with the digital, and I realized like I have issues with digital and I had issues with the camera because I always felt that for me, digital was better with a more shallow depth of field. The deeper the depth of field, I don't know, it just didn't work for me as well. And so because I was shooting pavement, which is very shallow, I started experimenting more and more, taking those kind of pictures with the camera. And so because I was walking around my neighborhood, I was looking for things like there's that azalea flower with the bicycle path over it. And then I ended up pitching this project to the Public Art Division, and I was granted an exhibition. So I pitched it as my project, so curator, photographer. So then I just kept going out deliberately, as a pedestrian, and sort of came up with this series.
Because it's the looking down that I've been looking at a lot of your photographs over the last couple of days in particular, and even though I don't necessarily want to talk about Paris right now, but I'm going to mention it. In that particular collection, there's a lot of looking down, and I know there's birds and skies in the pictures, but your observation, it seems to me, draws you to things on tables and things on pavements, and paint dropped on tarmac, and it's to let the listener into a story that we were discussing before, just so you don't feel like you're left out of this. I was talking about my uncle Jan in Holland, who spent his entire life finding £10 notes, it seemed, on the floor. And we used to say, Jan, how do you find all these things? He said, there's lots of interesting things if you just look down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always looking. And I'm always seeing, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I'm a scavenger at heart. And I was that way as a kid.
Do you think in projects?
No, I'd say my projects can come to me in a different way. It's either an immediate reaction, like with Tibet or the Atlantic Ocean project, The Crossing. Women in War was slow in the sense, I was sort of doing one subject, and then a couple of years went by. And then I realized this was a recurring theme, but it was also, I think, because that project was such an awakening of my own relationship to our family Holocaust history. In a way, I feel I had to mature alongside with it to be able to see it, undertake it. So that was, I mean, I didn't realize it was a project probably for 10, 12 years.
Marissa, you spent a lot of your life on the road, living out of your photographic backpack, as it were. And with you being an established mentor and teacher to photographers, I want to talk about that thing many photographers may have thought about, but for some reason, perhaps shy of starting, the idea of travelling to make some work. And I alluded to this in my introduction today about my single return ticket to and from Budapest, a country, Hungary, which I know you have a love affair with for your photographic study work. How do you see? What do you look for? What do you do when your passport takes you to an unfamiliar place? As the world unlocks over the next year, I would imagine adventure is something that we photographers may well be thinking about. What would your advice be?
Well, my first comment would be try to go from your left brain into your right brain. Mm-hmm. And not have any expectations of what you think you should be doing or seeing, or having to actually come away from the experience with necessarily anything. Mm. You know, you're giving yourself a lot of pressure because we've all been working and we're, being on an assignment, and we're also very sort of end result kind of, Western brain, if you will. Okay, if I go, I have to justify going by coming away with something. So I would say take all of that, which is really nice, but it's also very constricting. So I think it's just, if you go someplace, just say, okay, I've got my cameras, I've got extra batteries, I've got my walking shoes, and I'm just going to go and see what finds me. It's not necessarily you finding it, but sometimes you have to let the experience find you. So I was commissioned by the Downtown Public Library in Los Angeles in 2000 to photograph downtown Los Angeles like a neighborhood.
Yeah.
They had other photographers over the years photograph in other LA neighborhoods. And I was selected to do downtown because the Democratic Convention was coming there later that year. So anyway, I sat down with the director, we used to have something, this was pre-GPS, something called the Thomas Brothers map. It's like the Bible in LA. It's like your driving Bible. And so we opened to the page of downtown LA, and we literally took out a yellow highlight marker to think, okay, so what are my boundaries here? And of course, they were 4 freeways. And so I thought, how the hell do I start this thing? Because she said, well, we want some of this, and we want, the architecture or lifestyle, whatever it was. And I was so daunted. I thought, how on earth do I start this thing?
Yeah.
And so then the first day I thought, okay, I'm just going to drive around until I find a parking spot. And so I drove around, found a parking meter with 2 hours. So I parked, put my money in the meter, and then just started walking. And so that's how that whole project started. I sort of just trusted the journey, if you will. Yeah. I just thought I have to start. I have to just shoot a roll of film or 2 or 5 and just go. So that would be my advice, which is, let the road meet you. Let the experience meet you, because also you want to learn from it. You want to take it in. You don't want to impose your attitudes or expectations or judgments. You're the outsider coming in.
Do you integrate? Do you try to integrate, or do you try to be on the outside? I mean, in Tibet, it sounds like you integrated.
Well, Tibet, though, again, Tibet was extraordinary. We had a full-time guide and driver who I bonded with in like a nanosecond. I just love them. I just love them instantaneously. So, but I didn't really associate with too many other Tibetans. I mean, we were staying at like a Tibetan little hotel, so I talked to them. But like the one portrait of the woman who's sort of a half light, that I said to Dondup, our guide, I said, I'd like to just go in a really traditional Tibetan house. We just literally knocked on a door, stopped in the middle of nowhere, knocked on a door. And this lovely woman opened the door. And so Donda explained who I am and what I wanted to do. And the woman let us come into the house, and we did for a few minutes. And then I asked if I could take her picture. And that was the picture. I think if you travel with an open mind and open heart, and this is my advice, and let people come into your life. I mean, people might be a little more reserved these days just because our world has gotten a little meaner and scarier with the pandemic, and everybody's got a phone, taking pictures. But I think fundamentally being a photographer is also, you're absorbing the experience, and that becomes part of who you are rather than you trying to impose who you are, in a very rigid sense, unless you have a really specific calling, but you don't even know a place. The light is different everywhere. You may or may not have a response. I mean, I remember when I was living in Manila, I would go to Hong Kong frequently, and I was never inspired to take a photograph in Hong Kong. I think I have one photo from there that I think is sort of interesting. It just didn't speak to me.
That is interesting because there are photographers that just don't, for want of a far less base reaction, just get a place. They don't get it, or a country. They just don't have vision for the place they find themselves in.
Well, I think it's more than just seeing. We're not just machine, so you're seeing, but you're feeling, your intuition's working, your imagination's working, your body, your senses are activated, all of them. And visually also, photographers, there's subliminal stimulants that for some reason activate one, whether it's the light, the visual geometry. An architectural photographer would probably love Hong Kong, but for me, I loved going there. It was fun. But from a photographic standpoint, nothing. So I would, again, my advice is just be open. Be open to receive the experience. It's not always, maybe part of the journey isn't necessarily about getting the photographs. Maybe the place pulls you for something else.
Photographic block is something we touched on too recently, where you feel devoid of inspiration, where perhaps you do start to try too hard. Is there a stage where you can, or at least feel you can, run out of inspiration or ideas and get this complete block? Maybe for you personally even. Are there those days, Marissa, where you muse, what next? Or does Marissa Roth never get creative block?
Oh, God. I guess I don't pressure myself with that idea. But there were moments, I would say probably 10 years ago, before Tibet, where it was a tough time in my life, divorce. My oldest brother had died. I was just worn out with Los Angeles. And I thought, am I done? Is this it? And then it was like, okay, now what? I need to earn money. I think creative people were like vessels, and we pour out into projects or into life. But sometimes there has to be a phase where you somehow replenish yourself. But I don't torture myself worrying. And I feel in a way I've become even more creative these last years, where I've really allowed and Tibet was really the turning point. There was one photograph from the first trip that was a watershed for me. It was in the nunnery, and it almost looks like an abstract painting. There's just sort of these bursts of color. And then in the background is the sharp, there's some in focus, and you see sort of a figure by a door. And that was a pivotal image for me, because I really kind of let myself go, just photographing whatever it was without even thinking. And so on the second trip, I did a lot more of that, where I just felt the image. I didn't overthink the technical aspects. Of course, exposure was fine. I was focusing, but I didn't overthink what the result might be. I just let myself go. So I really feel Tibet, and even more so with the crossing, I've embraced even more that real deep creative space within myself. How I'll keep going, I don't know. I am at a big turning point in my life and career. I don't have any projects that are sort of driving me. I have a curating project I'm aiming towards, but creatively, I don't know. I feel like I don't know how it may all come together. I don't know. Will all this work somehow come together? I started drawing again. So I just feel like I'm in a fallow state. My little pandemic project just exploded out of me last year. So then that I'm going to try to publish as a book. So I don't suffer that. I think the creativity, it's who we are. I'm the same person as I was that 8-year-old kid, drawing and painting and cutting stuff out. It's the same source. So I think our minds are really the trap sometimes. You just kind of have to allow yourself to trust the journey, if you will. And as I said before, let let the journey come to you, let the creativity come to you, rather than trying to be so logical and binary. And what am I going to do now? And I've certainly done that because I was a journalist for so long. I was always on assignments. I was always used to being, here's what I need to do. This is what I need to get. And this is when it needs to be done. So yeah, I don't know. I would just, I hope I'll still be creative, but I'm open to anything, actually. And, if anybody has a project, throw it my way.
My sincere thanks to Marissa Roth. News of next Wednesday's special guest in a moment. If you're new to the title, every Friday, it's our now established moment of the week where we take a photo walk together. It's the Mailbag Show. So keep sending your inspirational ideas and photo stories and any other feedback to what you hear, if it's moved you, to studio@photographydaily.show so that I can feature you in the Friday photo walk. On that note, remember you can also send in pictures from your own photo walks to appear on the episode's show page online with links to your website or Instagram. If you haven't yet, join our private Facebook group and follow us on Instagram. Links to all this and our guests and our wonderful supporters on Patreon will be on the Photography Daily show page today, linked to in your podcast player app as always. Next Wednesday then, the return of another guest, this time the YouTuber Sean Tucker, to talk about the work that we make, more specifically to talk about his new book coming out, The Meaning in the Making.
I just met with someone this week who was sitting down and he's going, I feel like I've lost that early passion I had when I first got that camera. And I got it for Christmas and I went out, I just took photographs every day and I made a visual mess and I loved it.
We're going to take a deeper dive, as they say, into why we make stuff, what creativity means to us, and hopefully it's going to inspire you in your picture making. Tomorrow, of course, for Patreons only over on our Patreon channel, it's the Book Club. This week, a fabulous idea for you as we look at Mike Mandel's People in Cars. And I'm going to share those Budapest photo walk notes that I found. Music on the show was from the incredible artlist.io, and I look forward to photographing with you, hearing from you and talking with you on Friday for the photo walk.
Photography Daily is a Loading Zone production.